So today's guide is focused on players with motor issues that impact the way that they interact with the interface in World of Warcraft. In my mind, the biggest problem that players with motor issues are faced with is the lack of joystick support. I've released another guide today, link in the cards, talking about how to configure the thumbstick on a Chroma Orb Weaver to support mouse control. Sadly, there isn't currently a way to do this in WoW without third-party software, and the way that I've configured it, you will need a mouse backup for reasons I'll explain in that video. I have a simple mouse that I can use that enables me to move the mouse with larger hand movements rather than smaller hand movements, which are much more likely to cause severe tremors. I also have the mouse sensitivity turned right down as low as it can go. Even so, if I use only the mouse to move, then this is what happens. So obviously it's far more efficient for me to use WASD to get around. If you need to use the move pad, and I know a lot of people do, then I strongly advise you download the add-on MovePad Plus, because this adds a couple of extra functionalities to it, including the ability to toggle click to move on and off with a button. You can use this if you find mouse clicking easier than pressing buttons on a keyboard. But I also strongly recommend that you increase the size of the mouse pad using the UI scale options. As I talked about in my visual impairment guide, you may then have to use add-ons like sexy maps or bartenders to reduce the size of other screen components that are too large as a result of this. But you can, with the use of add-ons, find a balance that works for you. Hopefully Blizz will take note of these guides and add scale components to the individual bits of the user interface in the near future. Until they do that, don't be afraid to configure or build yourself an interface that works for you. Now, as you can see on the video that's playing right now, I've used Quartz and Tell Me When to pull the information I need in closer to my character. But the window created by those bars also serves a dual purpose, because it is an indicator of what I can comfortably click on with my mouse hand. Now this means I can turn my character to put the mob that I want into that space and know that I don't have to use the thumbstick, and I can just use the mouse to place the cursor over them and click on them. If you have problems like I do moving the mouse a large distance, you can also use this to add a toolbar closer to your character, like I'm showing in this video, which can reduce the distance that your cursor needs to be moved. Now you can resize this to your needs, and you can also configure the toolbar so that it's only displayed in combat, so that it doesn't block your view when you don't need it. Now, as I've said, I have FND, which means that my right hand, my mouse hand, has ridiculous amount of tremors. I do have tremors in my left hand, but these are much more manageable, and so I find it easier to use key bindings to fire off my abilities rather than being reliant on click mechanisms. If you are using the mouse to click on your spells and abilities, regardless of whether you have a motor issue or not, then I would strongly recommend that you try using keybinds, because they are so much more efficient. I appreciate that some people don't have that luxury, but if you can, switching to keybinds means you don't have to move the mouse around the screen and you don't have to click on things. Unless you're casting a click and cast spell, but more on that in the class specific guides, which should be coming out on Monday going forward. Keybinding on a very basic level means using a key press to activate a spell or ability instead of manually clicking on the toolbar. If you watch the video right now, you will see my wee dark iron dwarf attacking a combat dummy. using only key presses. How you set your keybinds will be very specific to you and the class that you are playing, and will be impacted by talent choices and borrowed power mechanisms. But if you spend a bit of time playing around with it, then you will find something that works for you. If you find the keyboard intimidating, then a device like an Orbweaver will reduce the number of buttons from a whole keyboard down to 20. Personally, if you can afford one, I highly recommend it over the full keyboard. And if you feel like 20 buttons is not enough and you'll need more buttons, then I would recommend looking at abilities you have and seeing which ones can be placed in macros together. For example, you may want to ensure you only use Blood Fury whilst Colossus Smash or Warbreaker is up. Or if you have a Blood Elf Demon Hunter, then creating a macro to use Consume Magic or Arcane Torrent, depending on what is available, can reduce the number of keybinds that you need. The recent GCD changes have made it far more difficult to do this, but I will be putting together a series of class guides with macros starting tomorrow, and that I hope will be really helpful for people who are struggling in this area. Another thing that I recommend, it's something that I do, and I've recommended to other people who said that they found it useful, is, and particularly if you play a number of different classes, is come up with a key binding scheme that will work across all of your characters. Personally, I use control keybinds for my CC abilities, alt keybinds for my movement abilities, and shift keybinds are for abilities that I don't need as part of my core rotation but are important nonetheless. For example, you can see on the screen that my bubble ability is set to Shift C, and when I hit level 32, my Shield of Vengeance will go in C. Both of these abilities are useful self-protection spells, but I will be using Shield of Vengeance a lot more than Divine Shield, so I can afford to use a shift modifier on it. Key bindings are very individual things, so you will need to experiment to find what works for you. I very rarely keybind abilities that I can use out of combat when there isn't any pressure on me, and I can take the time to mouse click on it. I generally focus on abilities that are part of my core rotation and that will have a big impact on my uptime on a boss and on my DPS rotation. But that's just me. You may feel that there are certain abilities that you need to keybind and that you need to use more frequently. As I said, play around with it, see what abilities you're using more often than others, and then have a play around with keybinds to see if you can find something that feels comfortable. If you're going to be doing a lot of keybinding, then I strongly recommend add-ons like NC Overbind and Bartender. They're both really useful for setting up keybinds. I generally use Bartender. It has a button on the main interface labeled keybindings, and once you click on that item, you can simply press the button over the icon of the spell to set the keybind, rather than going through the Blizzard keybindings menu. If you're going to have a lot of keybinds though, and particularly if you're going to use things like control and shift and alt modifiers, it is worth having a look in the Blizzard settings, and particularly in the interface and miscellaneous panels, to see what buttons you may use frequently that have a similar keybind. An example that springs instantly to mind is that toggle sound is set to Control S as default, and if you're using Control as a modifier, it's probably likely that you will press Control and S at some point during combat, which will mute your sound effects. So maybe unbind that. Now, these are just a few tips. I'll go into more specifics in the class guides, but there are a few suggestions here on ways that I have used add-ons to compensate for my motor issues, and which I hope will be useful to you. As always, I am more than happy to answer any questions that people may have. That said, if you found this guide useful or you have any suggestions, then please do get in touch.